accommodated by the executive and not by the king. The countries are multilingual. Are they binational, multinational? This is obviously one of the key issues we'll explore in this discussion. They have chosen federal solutions to accommodate some forms of diversity, though very differently, and the methods chosen have ignored other forms of diversity. They are clearly under tension through centrifugal movements, but also, at least in Canada, until recently, centripetal trends. I'm not sure anymore about Canada again. Both are highly studied in the context of post-conflict state restructuring, along with Spain. You know, they have been the regular invitees of the restructuring industry. Now, Belgium is not even rarely invited and generally not even mentioned. People are so afraid of what's happened in that country over the last 4 years. Differences, and we'll come back to some of them again, old versus recent, not in terms of country, but federalism. Geography, and it's very, very basic, you know, but geography and climate, when you compare, you have to go back to Montesquieu. Climate matters, geography matters. Association, dissociation, of course, they're different on that ground. We'll come back to it. The number of units. Approach to immigration, which with the link to identity politics and the conception of what the nation is and what nations need to be accommodated or not. Different approaches to regional integration and the impact on multi-level governance and multiple identities. The presence of Aboriginal peoples and nations in Canada, and of course not in Belgium. And of course, one of the major differences, and we'll talk about sociodemographics, is the fact that the push for decentralization and restructuring comes from the majority in Belgium and arguably from the minority in Canada. Now, if all of you know this map, but just to show how large Canada is, it's very basic, but when you compare it to Belgium, you see at the very far left of the map, Vancouver Island, so the sort of vertical island in green, just above the United States, that is bigger than Belgium. So it gives you just an idea of scale and of what a nation can mean on a territory of that nature, and what differences are considered to be normal or acceptable. To give you just one example, right now in Belgium there is intense debates. It's been approved, but for the first time, family allowances are going to be devolved to the communities. It's no longer going to be a federal matter. Well, in Canada, that's not an issue. For one thing, the middle class no longer has family allowances, so nobody talks much about them. But whether there is the same amount given to families in British Columbia or in Prince Edward Island is extremely theoretical in politics, because of course people don't even know what the others are getting generally, and there's no sense that the amounts should necessarily always be the same. There's no sense of citizenship entitlement of that nature, for all sorts of reasons, but including geography. It's very different in Belgium, of course, when the people live so close to one another. We'll come back to this, but because we have the map. Of course, you all know that, you know, Quebec is the majority of French speakers live in Quebec. But so in terms of territorial accommodation of a minority through federalism, Quebec is probably the best beneficiary of the system and the better known. But also Nunavut, so the pale blue region, which is a new territory which was created in 1999 out of the secession or the division with the Northwest Territory, and it's inhabited by a majority of Inuit people. So it's also ethno-accommodation, if you will, but through a territorial system of accommodation. It's just because they are the majority that they are, in theory, in charge of their own destiny, although they don't really have control much over their resources entirely now. There are about 1 million French speakers outside of Quebec, most of them in Ontario and New Brunswick. And I will come back to this when I discuss what is a nation in Canada and what's happened to, the impact of federalism on nationhood. This is Belgium. Sorry, the map is in French, but so we'll come back to the organization of Belgium, but basically, and you all know this, it is divided into a number of officially constitutive units, 3 communities, 3 regions on the same territory, with Brussels in the middle, Brussels being enclaved in the north, which is Flanders. Flanders is Flemish. The Walloon region speaks French. The very, very far east part is the German-speaking community. Again, in theory, it's a community, but in practice, it has its own territory, so it works in a territorial form. And the real crux of Belgium is Brussels, which is in the middle. So Brussels is the meeting point. It's the capital of Belgium. It's the capital of the French community. Oddly enough, it's the capital of Flanders as well. And this is the reason there are communities and regions in Belgium. Otherwise, you could probably have quite a simple territorial division, traditional territorial division. But neither the North nor the South wanted to give up Brussels. And what they have now is an ability to legislate and offer services in Brussels in certain matters. Schools, arts, and some social services to the population. And the population of Brussels can freely, for now, choose to adhere to a French or a Dutch system. So we've talked about geography, a little bit about sociodemographics, again, very sketchy and very reductive. I don't know how I got 60% English speakers in Canada. The figures don't add up, do they? Sorry, it would be. Probably should be 70%. But of course, English speakers is a misnomer in Canada because, sorry, I'm not at the right slide again. Voilà. Because in Canada, a lot of people are non-native speakers. Ukrainians, Chinese, Somali, but their lingua franca, their common language, of course, would be English, but they are no longer English Canadians. They are Canadians of various origin, but of course, in Quebec, we tend to call them English Canadians as a shortcut, but it is a shortcut. In Belgium, this is more or less what we think. About 60% Dutch speakers, about 40% French speakers, and a bit less than 1% of German speakers. But again, there are no official census giving statistics on language, which is very peculiar because the whole system is based on language accommodation. But since the 60s, there has not been one census in which the language question has been asked. It's too politically sensitive. And in Brussels, the institutions of Brussels are created as if everyone was either French or Dutch speaking. This is the way the accommodation is, except that that doesn't correspond at all to the demographics of Brussels, where half the population is neither one or the other. Half the kids born in Belgium are born to non-Belgian mothers. There is a number of languages spoken in that city that grows by the day. So there's a real dissonance there in terms of institutional accommodation and the actual society. Both are highly multicultural. I've just mentioned it. Official languages, you all know this, 3 in Belgium, 2 in Canada, plus Aboriginal languages in some territories. In the Northwest Territories, there are 11 official languages. Vast differences between the provinces in terms of how minorities of French and English minorities are treated. Federal history, Belgium is a recent federation, officially federal since 93. It probably became federal around 88, 89. Now, something a bit less basic, something I called constitutional pathology. I suppose there's a way of looking at it more positively. Belgium is an intensely reforming state. You see the 6 major state reforms it went through over the last 43 years, each time with transfers to the regions and the communities, so each time transferring power from the center to the units. It is a never-ending process. The ink isn't dry. They are still adopting the 6th reform, transfer competencies reform of the Senate and so on, and everybody's talking about the 7th reform. They know it will happen, and of course this has an impact on the sense of nationhood, particularly in Flanders. So there's a kind of hyperactivity, and you can contrast this to the paralysis in Canada, this sense of allergy to constitutional reform, this profound conviction, I would say, of people for the last 2 generations, that the Constitution cannot be reformed in Canada, that it has to be done either administratively in a roundabout way if you just want to make things work, or simply ignored in terms of official recognition through constitutional reform, that it's basically impossible and that the rules for changing the Constitution are too strict and could never be met. The trajectory, a federalism of dissociation, so from a unitary state to a federal one, and increasingly a confederal one. And in Canada, it's a bit more complex. Originally an association, but there was also division of territory at the same time. I don't have time to go into it, but basically you have the 2 trends, but the major one would be, at the beginning anyway, centrifugal and centripetal. You have a gradual evaporation of the federal order in Canada, in Belgium. No clear secessionist movement, no clear Flemish independence project, and yet sometimes I think Flanders might become independent before many other regions, certainly in the West. They're doing it gradually. They're doing it without provoking Europe generally, but they're, every 5-6 years reforming the Constitution so as to get more powers at the regional level and more transfers to Europe. Belgians are the most enthusiastic Europeans. They wanted the euro before everyone else. They asked to get it before the date at which the euro notes, banknotes, were issued. They have basically no attachment to national symbols, national Belgian symbols. So basically the idea is to perhaps keep Belgium as an empty shell, have most of the powers at the regional or community levels or at the European level, and perhaps at some point get rid of Belgium, but perhaps not. It might be very pragmatic to keep the flag and not to provoke anyone. We don't quite know what the blueprint is, or if there is a blueprint in Flanders, but certainly there are parties that believe and want Flanders to be independent, but they don't have a clear process to do so, and there's certainly no discussions about a referendum to verify whether the population wants it or not. Raison d'être, it's very obvious, originally to respond to Flemish demands for cultural recognition after decades of ignorance and oppression. Also for, the Walloons wanted more economic autonomy to avoid being dominated by the Flemish and having this central state dominated by the Flemish make decisions that would be negative for them. Of course, this has not worked. Wallonia is one of the poor regions of Europe, so they've had economic autonomy, but it hasn't served them very well. Is Canada multinational, if we could call it that way, or is its raison d'être cultural accommodation from the start? For most people here, I would presume it's obvious. You would probably have been quite convinced by the reading of history that Canada was originally a compact between 2 peoples, the French speakers and the English Canadians. This is the dominant view in Quebec, and it seems to make sense, but it's not universally shared in Canada, and some of, originally some believed that Canada should be a near unitary territorial federalism. These two visions still explain some of the differences in Canada about multinational recognition and accommodation. Federal institutions and I would say political dynamics, federal dynamics. Belgium is profoundly bipolar. I showed earlier that there are 3 regions, 3 communities over the same territories. It's pretty complicated. I can explain it later if somebody really wants to. But despite that, it's basically blue and white the way it looked on the map. Partly because of federal institutions, partly because of the society. 60-40 is a pretty close demographic balance. The federal institutions